I'm Mary Lyons, and I am the Wealth Woman.
And I'm Eric Alexander from Benchmark Income Group.
And this is the Big Wealth Podcast.
Everything you've ever been taught about money is wrong.
But don't worry, we're here to help.
On this podcast, we'll use the same tools you already know to actually help set you free.
Free to do what you want with your time, with your money, and with your energy. Free to live your life the way you have dreamt about.
So we're going to talk about wealth knowledge, personal reflections, and the financial industry news of the day.
Welcome to the Big Wealth Podcast. You know, recently I was at a conference and I heard a quote which has just been, rolling around in the back of my mind for probably weeks, I think, at this point. And that quote was, humans are hardwired to reject the unknown and to shy away from anything that is lacking in social proof. And I am obsessed with this, Eric. I cannot stop thinking about it because in terms of how we approach the world of finances and talking to people on a daily basis, I sometimes feel a little bit like a salmon swimming upstream because we're trying to get people to think very differently about their money. And this quote just really, to me, nails down why sometimes even when you show people all the facts and all the data and you can prove out everything about a concept, people still might reject it, or it takes a really long time for them to be able to accept the information, especially if it's coming from a different paradigm.
Right. Well, and I think it's also, maybe it's coming from a different person. Like if the person on the other end maybe has something to gain by you changing your paradigm, maybe there's a barrier there, right? If they're, hey, come buy my new car, that's really amazing. It's like, there's something in this for you, right? So I think part of it is we don't want to look foolish. Like we don't want to go follow someone down some path that ends up being the bad path. And we don't want to be the guy or the girl, right, that falls for the trick. And I think there's part of that in our brain that kind of fights us a little bit.
Yeah. So actually that's really kind of key there because I was reading a Harvard Business Review article that talked about why people resist change. And one of the things that it talked about was excess uncertainty, and then couple that with loss of face, right? So
nobody wants to look dumb.
No, nobody does, right? And I definitely understand that as much as the next person. But I do think it's really interesting to see how sometimes those things prevent us from finding things that could be really good for us. And to the social proof concept, I mean, if you look at how we shop online today, the first thing I do when I'm shopping for any piece of apparel or electronics or anything like that is I want to read all the reviews. And then I typically am going to lean into purchasing whatever
4 stars or better, right?
The most positive reviews. So I want to see how many people have reviewed it. The more, the better. And the more 5 stars, the better, right? And so I think that the danger of doing something like that, though, with finances is that finances are much more complex than does a shirt fit in a way that's flattering.
Right. Right.
Maybe
well, and it has a long-term effect on you too, right? It's you're going to notice 5 minutes after you get the shirt out of the bag whether it fits or not. On a financial plan, you may not know for 30 years that I went down the wrong path.
People reviewing the plan may or may not be qualified.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there's plenty of times that I get people's opinion on my own finances or anything of that nature, and I'm like, okay, I don't like how you're thinking about that. But I think there's a couple things actually that we can talk about here in terms of why we reject things that are unfamiliar. And I think this is particularly important here because when we start talking about how to structure finances and building assets that allow you to keep your money working from you that you can borrow against, and then going to find assets that produce cash flow. One of the things that Harvard Business Review also talked about in terms of resistance to change is that we don't like more work. So if what we're doing with our finances is an easy button and we just do what everyone else says to do and we have our money investing, we don't really have to think about it a whole lot. Whereas if you're actively participating in your own finances, that can be a lot more work, especially during the learning phase.
Yeah, well, that's the hard part of it, right? There's a famous quote by Henry Ford is that opportunity gets missed a lot because it shows up in overalls and looks a lot like work.
Yeah.
And so people look at that and they're like, yeah, I'm up to my eyeballs. I've got two kids in soccer and jobs, and we got to clean the house. We have this list, this laundry list of things that we've got to do every day, and that are already on our mind. And now you're throwing this at me.
Right.
Nope. It looks like a really cool idea, but I don't have time for that right now. So I think
Right.
there's a time factor, and do I even know how to go research it? Like,
Right.
where do I go to vet this thing out? Because I'm getting information from you, me, somebody in our office, right? Hopefully, but like we're getting that information from somebody different, and I don't have the ability to crawl inside their brain for the next 3 weeks.
Right. Well, and you just said something that was really interesting, and it had to do with the change side of things and being like, well, I don't have time to deal with this. The part of our brain that initially makes decisions on the very, very front end, the kind of gut reaction side of things,
Right.
is what I always call the crocodile brain.
Yeah.
And it is ruled by the amygdala. And when it sees something that is different, it triggers fear. And then we go into fight or flight. And so in a financial context, that either means I'm going to argue with you about why I don't want to do this, or I'm just going to run away from you so I don't have to have the conversation.
Right.
Right. And so when you start thinking about that sort of reptilian part of your brain that is driving it, I think it is absolutely key, even if you feel like you have researched a topic or heard people's opinions on a topic before, that you listen differently. And I say that in part because I had the opportunity to sit in a room full of millionaires a couple weeks ago. And I was bringing up some of the things that as a firm we do with our clients. And I would say that almost everybody that I talked to had heard of it, which is unique in and of itself, right? That's not
It's
usually what
unique.
happens in a room full of people. And they had all explored it and felt like they didn't get the data that they needed. And then in 15 minutes of conversation, they were like, oh my gosh, I now understand why something like this makes sense. I just didn't have the data before in order to validate this conversation. And seeing other people having the same conversation inside of that group created a sense of safety that eliminated to some degree that sort of confirmation bias of I've been exposed to this before, I already had a conclusion, I'm going to stick to that conclusion and reject the data that could change it. But I think part of that actually stems from the fact that we have a sense of social identity. And so if our peer group is exploring the same thing and coming to the conclusion that it makes sense, we like it. But if you're not yet a millionaire, right, and you're not around other millionaires who are considering or doing the same things, then sometimes it's really easy to just go, wow, okay, I don't know, and to back away from it.
Right. Well, and I think that's such the challenge with sort of upward mobility, right? Is
Yeah.
what Joseph Campbell, right? You're the average of the 5 people you hang around the most, which in COVID was like a 5-year-old, a 9-year-old, and my wife and I was
You
like, man,
regress.
we're not leveling up at all.
That happened to me.
But I think that's it, right? And we talked about this earlier. There was a great book called The Big Leap by a guy named Gay Hendricks. If you've never read it, it's a really short read. Highly recommend it. Total sidebar. But one of the things he talked about was people have this upper limit, like this upper limit problem of like, this is the best I'm going to do. And we always kind of bounce up against it. And one of the things that keeps us from breaking through that is this idea that, hey, my tribe isn't at this other limit. My tribe
Right.
isn't where I want to go. They're where I am right now. And there's the quote he said is, I cannot expand to my full success because it would cause me to end up all alone, be disloyal to my roots, and leave behind people from my past. And
Ooh.
it's like, it's a great, I'm telling you, the whole book is like this, but that one quote is great. It's like you're somehow being disloyal to the people that got you there. Like, oh,
Right.
you mentioned this
But
earlier about college, right? If nobody in your family's ever gone to college and you're the first, there's some people that are cheering you on, and some people are like, oh, really? Now you're better than us, right? And think
right.
about it when money starts coming into the mix.
Well, I think that sort of comparison game is key, right? Because we're constantly, whether we want to or not, we're constantly comparing ourselves to other people.
Right.
And I think there's a really good, at least in our household, I think it got said all the time, comparison is the thief of joy, right? Because when you start comparing yourself to other people, frequently you find yourself lacking. But when you're
Right.
comparing yourself to people and they seem similar to you, that's when you bond, right? Because you're like, ooh, we're the same, right?
Right.
Let's deepen this friendship. And what you're talking about with that, hitting your upward limit and that sense of isolation, I can definitely say there have been moments in my life where that is true, where maybe I'm substantially out earning my peers. And so I get to do things that they don't get to do. And then when I'm talking about those things, because it's exciting to me, because they can't relate to it, or because it's something that they don't have the ability to do, or the means to do is probably the better description there. There's this sort of like, oh, and it is isolating because what you're like, hey, celebrate with me about,
Right.
frequently that other group is going, why are you bragging about this? And so you begin to almost feel this sense of shame or isolation for your
Right.
successes. And it is easier that from a social impact, right? It is
Just not say
easier
anything.
to either, yeah, don't share them, in which case you are isolated, or don't do them so that you aren't pushed out of the group because you're different. And I'll say this is true as well. So I have a client who was aggressively funding a whole life insurance policy, still is, so
Right.
that he can go and buy assets that are producing cash flow. And I recently was speaking to him and he's like, yeah, I just never talked about it because I didn't want people to be like, what are you doing? And it was isolating the couple times I tried. So he's like, so I didn't talk about it. But he mentioned to me that he was at a happy hour a couple weeks ago, and this other gentleman who was there was sort of hinting at or using some language that is similar to the way we dialogue about that process. And he was like, wait a minute, are you doing this too? And they've become fast friends because they can talk about it with one another openly and freely. And I just thought that whole anecdote when he was telling me that was really kind of fun because it speaks to that, like, it's okay to be different, it's not okay to be weird,
Right.
right? But I think people don't even want to be different. They want to look around and be like, oh, I fit here. And so I think when you have something that is unique that you're doing, or at least it feels unique because you don't know anybody in your immediate peer group who's doing it, then you just sort of don't talk about it. And because you're not talking about it,
Right.
you lose the opportunity to find the other people who are also doing those things. But
It sort of feels
it's
like politics, actually. It's like
yeah,
you throw out a couple of code words, and you're waiting on somebody in the room to go, kind of either joke about the code word, and
I
you're like,
got
okay,
you.
I can go talk to that person, or all right, I
I
got
can
to
talk
steer.
about this here.
Right.
Yeah,
But
but
it,
I
yeah,
I
but it's
think too,
isolating.
it is, because if you think about it, let's talk about wealth for a minute, right? In this country, we spend a lot of time talking about the 1%, which,
Right.
from an income perspective, is any household earning above 540,000, I think, in the most recent data. And it's different in terms of net worth because that skews by age and that sort of thing. But from an income perspective, that's kind of the rough number. And I think the thing that happens is it's really like, even if you fall into the top 1%, I find that frequently people who are in that 1% are still asking, right, for the confirmation of their financial plan from people who are less successful than them and
Right.
frequently less wealthy than them, right?
Right.
And so there's a tendency to go, hey, mom and dad, what are you doing? And at some point, if you want to exceed where your parents are, you have to find different people to give you advice in order to get there. Or if you look around at your peer group and they're all at one net worth level or cash flow level, if your personal goal is to go beyond that, you need to find the people who are already there and start asking them those questions. And I think that is, I mean, it's just like you said, that is extremely isolating
Right.
because you may be in between. And so you're leaving your peer group and looking for another group, but you aren't where they are yet. And so I think that can trigger a lot of insecurity.
Well, and the other half of that is if you're in one peer group and you're at the top of your peer group, it is a big humble pie moment to go to the next peer group because you're used to being the top person in your group, right? And so there's a certain
Right.
amount of not just aspiration to get to the next group, but a humility to go, am I really ready to step into this? Because now I'm going to be around a bunch of people that are eons beyond where I am, and I have to be uncomfortable and okay being uncomfortable in that place, right? And I
that
think
goes
that's no small thing.
right back to loss of face, right? And more work. And then I think it also triggers another thing that was talked about in that same HBR article, which was excess uncertainty. I don't know what happens when I get beyond this
Well,
point, or what
and I
to
don't know
do,
what I
or who
don't
the
know.
people are. Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
That's
So
the
it's
scary
easier
part
to
of it.
stay where it's safe. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Definitely
Even if
easier.
you want to grow, right, and that's the challenge is that upper limit, that the next part of that step is a big step. I mean, it may on the little graph it's not very much, but it's a big step, right? Because every growth is a judge against where you are, and so you've got to
Right.
be. I think you've got to have that humility. You've got to have the hunger, but you also have to have a little bit of patience. Look,
Right.
I'm not chasing this person. I'm trying to just be better than what I was yesterday, not where someone else
Right.
is today. And so being able to deal
You're
with
on
that.
fire today. Say that again. I actually think that's key. It's not about being better than the person who's next to you. It's about taking the step forward in your own personal development.
Well, and being humble enough to look stupid. What was that? What was the quote? And sorry, it's some salty language coming here in just a second. But if you're going to be a badass, you have to be willing to look like a dumbass for a little bit, and sort of that
Yes.
like taking that first step and look stupid. Sorry for the
Right.
salty language there, but but that's the ability to go, look, I don't know, and I've got to be okay saying I'm a moron. Talk to me like I'm three, right?
Right.
And being okay with that, knowing that, hey, look, compared to everyone else, I'm okay. I'm just trying to
I
get
think
better.
that might actually be one of the hardest things, though, right? To be able to
Oh my
say, I don't
gosh.
know. I think
Yeah.
as it's, I think we are trained as we get older, right? We want to be experts. We want to know what
Yeah.
we're doing. We don't want to fail. One of the most impactful books for me, probably in the entirety of my life, was John Maxwell's Failing Forward,
Yep.
which was the idea that if you aren't making mistakes and failing multiple times a day, that you're stagnant. Like if you're just comfortable all the time, you're not actually improving in any way, shape, or form. And I think that that is what has, at least for me personally, enabled me to ask the questions when I don't know, is that there's no way to improve without making mistakes, right? and
Yeah.
and at some point you have to trust in your own ability to figure things out. And I remember saying to a client not too long ago, so they showed up and they said they wanted to retire in a 3 to 5 year time period.
Right.
And so we built them a plan that would allow them to get to full income replacement based on their existing assets and how they were structured, just making some moves that would enable them to get there in that time period to full income replacement. And they opted not to move forward with the plan. So they ended up doing sort of a partial implementation and coming on board, but not
Right.
really going all in. And I asked at the moment where they were kind of saying, well, here's what I want to do, here's what I don't want to do. I said, so help me understand why you aren't implementing this other portion of the plan. And they said, well, I don't know. I just talked to a couple of my neighbors and my parents, and none of them are doing anything like this. So I just figured, um, you know, I'm not going to do something like this right now. And I kind of pushed because that's my nature, right? Help me understand if there were other things going on.
Right.
And ultimately they said, I don't have the time to dedicate to really understanding this right now. I don't really understand it, which is that sort of uncertainty, right? It's going to take more work for me to figure it out. And then the tribe that I belong to right now isn't already doing something like this. And I just remember, because this person is, running a business. I said, look, do you abdicate the responsibility for how the business is run by social proofing the methodology? And they were like, absolutely not. Like, I'm making those decisions and analyzing the data. And
Right.
my response was, well, if you're working that hard to make money in the first place, don't you think you should spend the time to make sure that it's efficient and doing what you need it to do on the back end? And so luckily, after probably about 6 months, they're open to revisiting the plan and really digging deep. And some of
Right.
that I think is life situational to what's going on in their life, but
Right.
kudos to them for coming back to it, right?
Yeah, well, you can only absorb what you can hold at that point, right? So I think some of it is meeting people where they are, but to that point of asking others, and then we probably need to close this out because everybody's on their way home. But
Yeah.
the one of the things I always caution people on is like when you're asking somebody what they think about what we've talked about, like you're going to go home and you and your spouse, you and your partner are going to think about this thing, and then you're going to go ask another question. Hey, mom and dad, what do you think about this? Hey, so and so, right? Think about the question from their perspective. Like you're asking them a question and they've got two answers. Yes, you should do that. That's awesome. Or no, you shouldn't. That seems scary. Right?
Right.
If you say yes, if they say yes in their brains and they're not thinking about this, but this is the mathematical equation going on in their brain is if I say yes and it ends up going bad for them, I'm somewhat responsible because I greenlighted it. If they say
Right.
no and you don't do it, they may have missed out on something really amazing, but it's a maybe.
Right.
Because how do you prove a negative, right? But
Right.
if I say no and they don't do anything, then they're no worse off and no better off than they are right now. And right now they're doing okay. And so I think a lot of that comes to what does the other person on the other end have to gain or lose from a yes or no question or a yes or no, do this, don't do
Right.
this. Um,
Well, the other thing is you don't know what the other person has or has not been exposed to,
well, that's the other
because they
part.
may have looked at a similar proposal, right? But in a way that wasn't explained properly, or where the outcomes weren't properly like documented, or maybe it was a partial look at that without a complete analysis, which we see happen all the time in finances.
Right.
Um, and
We
I
saw that
think
last
that's
week.
key. Yeah. And I would say, like, it's good to get feedback from other people. You don't want to go into something blind. But
Sure.
I think if you are going to ask other people for their opinion about something, you need to be 100% sure that they were exposed to the same data as you and that you are actually going through the analysis together, as opposed to just, oh, I once thought about something like that and decided not to do it. And here's why. Because the fact of the matter is, things change, right? The financial tools change and evolve over time, and the strategies that you need also have to change and evolve over time.
Right.
So, I think the real thing is, if you are going to think about what your goals are, find other people who have met those goals, and then make sure that they have had the same exposure to the strategies that you have yourself, and then brainstorm about whether or not it is a good idea, right?
Right.
But it needs to be a complete set of data, right? And incomplete findings are not helpful. And I think doing the deep dive, making
Right.
sure you have the evidence, not relying on opinion, that's what you need to do. And if you are social proofing, make sure it's from the right group in order to
Well,
get some of that data.
and I would argue, and I'll close out with this, is if you're having and this is just from me to my spouse, and I'm sure no one else has this impact in their lives with their spouse. But if I've heard something and I'm like, this is really cool, and I take it home to my wife, I explain it like really quickly, and I summarize all the high points and what I remember, and I don't go through any of the data below it. And so my wife looks at me and is like, that's dumb. Why would we do that? But I don't understand. How do you tie your shoes every morning? I think is her phrase. But
It's like playing telephone, right? I mean, it's
totally like
always
playing
different
telephone.
by the time it gets around the circle.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, the person that I heard the data from was actually a professional explaining the information, and I'm not, right? It sort of explaining what was going on the other end, and she's looking at me very differently than she would of somebody that's a professional in that, whatever that world is, right?
Right. Okay, so key takeaways.
Yeah.
I think you have a
Thank
quote.
you.
Is it I know it from Ted Lasso. I think you're going to cite the original source here.
Oh yeah, from the Ted Lasso from Walt Whitman. Be curious, not judgmental.
Right. Look for the exploration, try and find the ways that things work, right? And then also explore the ways that they don't work, but approach everything with an open mind. I think that's key number one. I think key number two is make sure that you are looking at the facts and the evidence as opposed to researching common conceptions. right?
Right.
We're not looking for a consensus of opinion. We're looking for the actual data. So I think making sure that that's what you're getting is key here. And then I think third, anytime you are going to have other people weigh in, you need to be 100% sure that they have been exposed to exactly the same data as you. And any good financial advisor will open up the meeting to a third party coming in and walk through the same information. Because if they are truly convicted that what they're doing is the right thing for you, it's an opportunity for them to gain an additional client. And if they see it as a threat instead of an opportunity, that should tell you something about their security and their recommendations right
Right.
there. So on that note, you guys have a great day. Thanks for joining us. I am the Wealth Woman. You can find me at The Wealth Woman on Instagram or Facebook, and you can find me on LinkedIn as Mary Kane Lyons.
And I'm Economics with Eric on Instagram and Facebook, and I think you can find me on LinkedIn at Eric S. Alexander on LinkedIn. Have a great day. Have fun.